Okay, we are now recording. Welcome everyone to our weekly call. Good to have you all on. Firstly, thank you to our long-term sponsors, DNS-related, although many of you will be aware that that sponsorship is coming to a close. So anyone interested in discussion about becoming the new call sponsor, do reach out to me separately and let's have a chat. But thank you to DNS-related for their sustained support, which is much appreciated. Okay, so the main theme of the discussion today is going to be the report published last Monday, so slightly earlier than anticipated, by ICANN's Technical Study Group, and its report on gTLD integrations with alternative naming systems. Not the snappiest of report titles, but certainly functionally it works. It does what it says on the tin, as someone once said. So I'm going to sort of go through that, and then we'll see how we go for time, and I'll cover some sort of news from the last week or so, details of some forthcoming events, etc. But I'll juggle that depending on the time available. So apologies in advance, I will be doing a fair amount of talking. I will keep an eye on the chat and the participant list. So if anyone's got any questions or comments as I go through this sort of commentary on the Technical Study Group's report, either pop them in the chat or raise your virtual hand. And when I pause for breath, I will bring those comments in or bring you in. If I seem to disregard something for an extended length of time, assume I haven't seen it and feel free to unmute and tell me, and we can have that discussion. Okay, yeah, this is a first cut sort of thoughts on the report, which is sort of fairly long. And I did this or finalized this on Friday, so I didn't have a huge amount of time looking at it. So as I say, I'll happily take comments on it as we go through, particularly if there's something that you think I've misconstrued or you had a different take on, or if you think I've missed out something significant. But what I plan to do is to just give you my take on the report. Usual health warnings. This is my take on the report, not the report itself. So if a particular point matters to you, do read the report proper. Don't just take my word for it before you act on anything in this sort of first pass of it. But as I say, the report was published last Monday, 10th of August, and is currently out for public comment. So I think there's going to be a number of iterations on this topic. Some overarching points first. I guess the group, unsurprisingly, it's an ICANN Technical Study Group. Yeah. Obviously, they're keen that the security stability of the DNS is maintained, and also it remains universally resolvable, which is, as I say, not a massive surprise that would be important to ICANN. And clearly, if there is any proposed integration with one or more alternative naming systems, because that's what we're talking about, then there need to be sort of clear safeguards, accountability, etc. And as I said, this first pass from the group, which was published in fairly short order, is currently up for public comment until I think the latter part of September, and then there'll be another iteration. And on some of the slides, I'll put some further comments towards the bottom of the slide. So this one, for example, at this stage, this isn't endorsing alternative name systems, alternative routes. It's simply looking at whether there's a way to work with them. and a way that understands and mitigates the risks. So that's really, I suppose, the intent of this work. So it's looking at whether the same string could be resolved in an alternative naming system, and whether that integration would work, but looking at it from the perspective of understanding the implications on the DNS itself, and looking for safeguards. And I think I'm probably repeating myself slightly. And I'm not going to go through all the bullet points on all of the slides. It'd take too long. I'll let you just scan those. But yeah, essentially, this is looking at the namespace, the alternative naming systems, and how they resolve, and a mechanism for integrating between those systems. That's really what's covered by the group. And really, some of the challenges are you could end up with the same label, but different answers depending on the browser, the application, whether you've got browser extensions, different configurations. So that's obviously a concern, that you no longer have a single answer for a single label, which obviously the implications of that would need to be understood, particularly as given what we're all used to. I think it's reasonable to assume that most users would work on the basis that one name means one thing, not multiple things, depending on how you get a response. And as it says on the slide, in integrating multiple systems, there could be both inconsistencies, there could be collisions, there could be deliberate, whether it's impersonations or whatever. So it does raise complexities that need to be fully thought through. Some of the sort of risks that the technical study group has looked at are things like on security, authentication, risk of spoofing, credential theft, abuse, obviously, because that's a concern generally for the ICANN community, the impact on stability of the DNS, how things might fail, etc. But probably the most important one is the impact on user trust and user understanding if there are inconsistencies. Yeah, now I put some more words that are on the bottom of the slide, but I think you get the drift of that. So I suppose where it becomes interesting is looking at the direction that the study group is heading in, which is a shared label isn't evidence of a shared identity or destination, because if you've got multiple namespaces, then potentially the same label could land in different places on the different namespaces, that could, I mean, whether these are problems or not, certainly there are things to understand, but it could create identity issues, security issues, issues around accountability, and so on. As I said earlier, obviously, from the point of view of ICANN, their primary interest is sorry, someone wanted to come in? No. Is for the DNS, specifically the gTLDs, so that they need to understand what the implications are for that. The report seems to favour integrations that cooperate with rather than compete with or replace the DNS in that scenario, which is again unsurprising. Um, so looking at transparency, then yeah, it sort of surfaced the point that if there are alternate resolution paths, then that needs to be transparent to the various stakeholders, whether that's registrants, end users, or others for various means. And there needs to be a way of sort of maintaining accountability for that, so that it's properly understood. Having controls, truism generally, are important, and should give some degree of control over things like sort of change management, so the different behaviours, how abuse is handled, and so on, and being clear who has those controls for the different facets. Giving end users predictable, understandable outcomes is really what's important here. So if you have the integration, you don't really want to just completely confuse behaviors from the perspective of end users. That clearly will be a bit of an own goal, if you will, but ICANN were it to help facilitate that. So some of the recommendations, with some of those caveats and so understanding of the situation in mind, then for any given alternative namespace to be integrated with the DNS, then I think it's a reasonable assumption that ICANN would require a formal RCEP request to go in. And there'd be an explicit security and stability assessment of the proposal. So this would be, just to be clear, specific to any given alternative system, not just an overarching integration with all other systems. So that will be the intent. It will be per occasion RCEP would be required. Probably one of the key ones, which is why I've highlighted it, looking at the sort of recommendations for registry operators, it's treating the integration as a registry service, potentially. Bear in mind, this is a draft report. So it would be covered, that integration would be covered within the registry service framework. So it can't just be deployed by a registry as something entirely separate. Again, which is understandable given it potentially impacts on gTLDs. So it's not just something that the registry can do in the background. So it's not just the integration that's covered, but it's the way it's integrated is also important as well. At least, again, that's a recommendation. These are also obviously subject to the public consultation process. So this is just well, again, reiterating that each integration will be treated separately, and would have to be reviewed through the RCEP process, and you can see the likely steps there that will be required in that sort of decision process if things go through as per the report. And this is just some thoughts on what some of the key issues might be for public comment. From what I've seen, it's fairly free format, the public comment process, so you could take any angle you wished. So that these are simply some initial thoughts on that, which is, what are the technical requirements that are necessary? How can you objectively test against those requirements? Where should responsibility sit? Who should be responsible if there's a potential to get different outcomes to a query? How's that going to be understood? What level of sort of review process and ongoing reporting is going to be proportionate? And what are the potential sort of remediation steps, and who's involved in that decision-making process? There's plenty of other questions, by the way. These are just a starter for 10 from me. So, as I said, there's not an official set of questions that you're required to answer if you want to respond to the report as part of the public process. So be interested to know if different people had completely different takes on this, if you've had a chance to look at it as yet. So yes, some initial conclusions, though. If you've got an identical string in different namespaces, then you shouldn't assume that they're equivalent, because you may get very different answers in the different namespaces. If this is going to be integrated, then certainly the group seems to be concluding that, and this is not massively surprising, security, stability, transparency, and accountability are, if you like, the gate conditions to even make a conversation worthwhile. And obviously the public consultation is an important part of the process to start to sort of firm up on some of the group's initial thoughts, which were put together very quickly. I think the group only met for roughly 2 months, so I was quite surprised they turned out that initial report as quickly as they did. And observations, since I did get a question today about the implications for anyone that was applying for a new gTLD in the round that closed on Wednesday of last week. Are there implications for them? Possibly. But with the caveat, you'd have to go through the RCEP process if the proposals from the study group are accepted, or something resembling the current proposal are taken on board. So it might be a useful starting point, but there'd be a fair bit more work to do before you could actually you even contemplate an actual integration with an alternate namespace. Let me just pause there. As I say, apologies for going through that quite quickly. I'll happily go back through any of the slides if it's useful, but let me just stop sharing my slides for a moment and just see if anyone else has a chance to look at the report from the study group and has any initial comments. Philippe, unsurprising that you might.
Thank you. Hi, Andrew. But yeah, to your question, the internet service providers of ICANN or the GNSO will probably respond to this. But what I'm going to say is just my input to the process. Obviously, I don't know what you made of the sort of the form of the report, but that was a difficult read for me. I don't know if it's because I'm not a native, or my impression was that it was written with AI, not generated with AI, but at some point there was some automation used. Maybe that was just me, but as you said, it was only 6-8 weeks, maybe, which accounts for the form of the report. But it was really difficult compared to something out of the PDP, for example, where you generally have a summary of the recommendations and you can have a broad outlook of the findings. This is not the case here. It's scattered all over the place. You have to look out for the musts and recommends and all the rest of it. So that's a bit difficult. It seems that the the group essentially focused on the contractual. I'm hesitant calling this amendments because we don't know how that will end up being used by ICANN.org. But and the result of this is that in terms of assessment of the security and stability impacts, it's just at one section at the very end, and it's not very useful. I think there's a lot of emphasis on the need for consistency, as you said, the need for consistency between the two namespaces, which is useful. But to me, that issue of ensuring stability and security went beyond that. And to the point of developing potential contractual changes, I think as of principle, it raises an interesting question as to whether, for example, this might be used in the contracts that may be developed with the registries that would have that sort of application in mind. I mean, the applicants to the new round that just closed last week, because this is not a PDP, so maybe it's just an ICANN's concern, if you see what I mean. But it was not, the point being that it was not developed by the ICANN community. It was developed by a group of experts, and that's good, and probably the timeline accounts for that. But on the other hand, I think it will have to be given sufficient review by the ICANN community if ultimately that goes into contracts for gTLD registries and registrars. So those were my initial impressions of the report. Mindful that again it was really a short timeline, but I agree with your characterization. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks. And I think those are really sort of good, fair observations for what it's worth. One thing which I didn't know until today, because for other reasons, I had a look at the mailing list that the study group had set up to communicate. And from a quick scan of that, it looked like the report was only shared even with the study group on the day it was published. So it was pretty much pulled together and published almost simultaneously.
Right.
So I think it needs to be treated as very much a first draft. I mean, to be fair, it's called a draft, but I hadn't realized it was maybe so draft that it was pretty much.
I don't think there's much. Yeah, there wasn't much review on this within the group, but I'm not surprised. Yeah, really, it dwells on the reasoning rather than the conclusion, things like that. Which, if you're involved in the work, you sort of go directly to the result, and so that it's a difficult read.
Yeah, I certainly found the formatting unhelpful. Even simple. I mean, okay, this is me being really picky, but even simple things like the section titles were like sort of 3/4 of the way across the page.
There's no diagrams. There's no, and
yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's so much helpful. But anyway, I know that's just the form, but it takes a lot of effort to go through the report and try and provide some inputs for next steps.
Yeah, fair comments. Thanks for those, Philippe. Has anyone else had a chance to even peruse the report and have any initial thoughts? I'll give you all a chance to think. And if you have, either pop something in the chat if you're not able to talk, or just unmute and jump in if you do. Or is it just too premature to even have the chance of looked at it? Because it was literally last Monday when it came out. Not seeing anyone raising their hand or unmuting. Okay, I'll assume not. Well, if it's useful, I will share the slides post the call with the health warning. They were done fairly quickly, and the report itself is a draft. So if you're going to use them as the basis for public consultation, please take time to look at the report as well. Not just rely on my take on it, because you could come to a completely different point of view on some things, or pick out things I've not even mentioned, because I'm probably missed a few things just in the time it took to turn those slides around. Okay, all right. Well, look, let me then move on. But hopefully that was sort of a useful first pass, at least. Can't see where my slides have gone. Oh, there they are. Right. Okay, so as I say, I'll share these slides after the call, in case they are of use to you. Let me then just sort of move on to some of the things that have happened over the last week. As always, those of you that are on the mailing list for the weekly headlines will have had these this morning. If you want to be added, just send me a message and I'll add you to that mailing list. And I won't go through all of them, but I'll just call out some of the things that I think are particularly noteworthy. The first of which is an article about title, "Every browser just got a major privacy upgrade and most people don't know it," which is quite an intriguing headline. What it was actually referring to was that browser support for encrypted client hello, that's the an extension to TLS 1.3, positioned as a key privacy tool. Interesting article. It was not unreasonable, but it didn't look at some of the downsides of using ECH. So not least of which that the CDN operator gets a lot of knowledge, or gains a lot of knowledge of what you're doing. So yes, you get privacy from network observers, but you don't get privacy per se. It's just it depends who you want to have privacy from. So to that end, you'll see on the slide here. I think if you want a more rounded view of ECH, look at our sorry. First, if you want a more robust privacy, then Gianpaolo, who's on the call at the moment, has got his client-facing relay internet draft, which hides the source IP address from, in this case, the CDN operator, if we're thinking about ECH. So you get rather more privacy than is granted by ECH itself, amongst other benefits of the client-facing relay, but also to understand some of the potential downsides of ECH for certain use cases. Take a look at our ECH deployment considerations draft, and I'll put links to both of those on the slide. So if you're not on the mailing list for the headlines, you'll have that after the call. There's also an interesting, this is just a reminder that RFC 10023 enables for sale tags to be added. Now, we may come to different conclusions how interesting or not these are, but it does mean that you can have a for sale DNS text record, so that you can let, or domain owners can make it known in a machine readable way that their domain is for sale, and you can provide some extra information with that that's discoverable. Pros and cons in that, put some of them on the slide, which I mentioned in the article, but the RFC is now published, so at least there's a standardized way of doing it. So yeah, that just caught my eye. Let's see, Alexei, I made a for sale anything over IPv6. Good to know, Lexi. As I said, I'm not going to go through all of these on the call. You can read through them at your leisure. Another one, though, chance just to remind you all by highlighting this, the bottom one on this screen. There's a write-up of on the Nominet blog. It's only a short post from Mike Gieben. Apologies to him if I've completely butchered his name. A creator of GoDNS and CoreDNS, explaining how funding from round one of Nominet's DNS fund has helped him to build more open source software. And that's an unsubtle way of reminding you all, if you were thinking of applying to the Nominet DNS fund, you've got till end of today to get that in. So the deadline is looming for that, imminent, I think perhaps is a better way of putting it. So hopefully you've already got your applications in, but if not, you've still got a short amount of time, I believe. Yeah, we've just been talking about the initial report on the from the Technical Study Group. There's that. So I won't repeat that. Actually, the one I should have highlighted as well, bottom of the screen, looking beyond the numbers, understanding malicious domain registration data. Intrail Consulting Group published a report earlier this year, I think it was in June, that at least 10% of new gTLD domain names registered during 2025 had subsequently appeared on block lists, and thought they estimated that the true share of domain names registered during 2025 by malicious actors was closer to 20%, which is quite an alarming number. 1 in 5 domains from registrations from last year. I think about 400 million last year. So roughly 100 million of those domains owned by bad actors, potentially. Sorry, 80 million. It's 20%. Anyway, 3 of the ICANN team from, I think, all from the office of the CTO, published a blog post just looking at some differences in methodologies and definitions between their numbers and those of Intrail Group, which that's what the link is on this bullet point. I've got some concerns with that, and I'm planning to publish something on that possibly the middle of this week. So expect to see more on that probably I'll mention it on the call next week, and I've slotted it in on the agenda to talk about in a few weeks' time. So we'll come back to this topic, but I thought it was worth mentioning. You can see the ICANN blog post using the link on the screen if you're interested. Other things, as I missed most of these, but Infoblox talked about drop catch. They published a series of 3 articles on a new threat that I think it's from their threat intel team, I believe it was. That's quite significant, worth a read. As I say, there's 3 articles in total. You'll get the gist of it from the first one, but there are 2 others as well, and the links to those are included in my very short summary just on the screen there. I think that was probably all I was going to mention just now from the news headlines. Thanks, Jim, in the chat has confirmed it was from the threat intelligence team, which makes perfect sense as it's about threats. Just briefly, other things, I mean, lots of other stuff happening. I'm not going to go through all of these non-DNS related, but again, they're in the sort of weekly headlines. I might mention top of this screen thing about Anthropic planning to watermark Claude's AI-generated text. And there's a whole discussion about watermarking over the last week, but then an article in Bleeping Computer that there's some AI watermark removers already available, but it's questionable how effective they are. So it might be easier to see what stuff has come out of generative AI of various sorts, which is, I think, a good thing. Yeah, in terms of sort of impending deadlines, I mentioned the Nominate DNS Fund today. Within the next week, call for presentations for OAuth 47 closes on the 24th. Also on the 24th, if you've got any ideas for the community day, that closes on the 24th. And then on the 25th, if you're planning to contribute to ITU Study Group 17's Content Week, the deadline for contributions for that are the 25th. So a few things coming up in roughly a week's time. And then more stuff after that, which I won't bother going through, but it's there on the slides. Not aware of any significant events until OSNOG in September. The next one you'll find me at will be ICANN 87, ICANN 87, that's the AGM in mid-October. And then ITF, towards the bottom of the page, I'll be at in San Francisco, and the IGF, Internet Governance Forum, in December. I plan to go to RIPE 93, but remotely rather than in person, as it's literally the week after ICANN 87. And I think I would get back the day before it starts, which would be bad. Anyway, yes, there's lots of stuff from September onwards through to the end of the year, as you can see. Vicky has put in the chat, NANOG's currently looking for candidates. I'm not sure. Apologies, Vicky, I'm probably being a bit thick. BOD, if you know that. Board of Directors, thank you. Well anticipated. So NANOG's looking for Board of Director candidates, and also a timely reminder that DNS OARC is currently, I think as we speak, advertising for a new president now that Phil has stepped down from that post. So that either or both of those may be of interest to some of you. Yeah, in terms of other things we've got lined up to discuss next week, Lou Chao-Yi is joining us to reprise a paper he gave at the last ICANN meeting, summarised DNS and security academic conference papers from last year, just to give a sort of pen picture of, I think it's about 30 papers that he found by doing a trawl of the literature. It was a really interesting, not at all dry presentation, in my opinion. So I've asked him to reprise that, but with a little bit more time, because I think he only had about 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes in Seville to cover that. And then almost certainly the following Monday, we'll revisit the European Commission Multi-Stakeholder Forum on Internet Standards Deployment with some of the participants of that group, subject to their diary availability. Just really to chat. You may recall we talked about that, I think, a couple of weeks after the group first met at the beginning of the year. So now we're over halfway through the year. It seemed appropriate just to touch base and see how that's developing. So we'll do that in a couple of weeks' time, just to sort of whet your appetite for topics on our immediate agenda. And I think, yeah, that was everything from me. So let me stop sharing. Apologies if I do that properly. Why can't I see? Stop share. So yeah, there's a bit of a rapid run through. Let me pause for breath there and see if anyone's got anything from any of that you wanted to comment on, or indeed anything else that you wanted to mention whilst we're on the call together. So if you do, now's your chance to jump in, either by just typing in the chat or unmuting and talking, whichever is easier. As I wait a few seconds for anyone to do that. Nothing immediately seems to have caught anyone's eye. No. So, okay. All right. Well, as I say, hopefully that was useful. I'll probably get the link to the recording and also the slides out certainly by Wednesday. If you've got any comments on the technical study group report when you've had a chance to take a look at it, please come back, share those. That'd be really useful. Particularly if you've got a totally different take on the report itself. Always good to have multiple opinions on that, as people are starting to think about any responses to the public consultation. And if need be, we can always put some time on the agenda in a few weeks' time just to revisit the topic if it's useful, when you've had a chance to absorb it properly. But anyway, that aside, a few minutes earlier this week, which is no bad thing. Thanks, everyone. I hope that was useful. Have a fantastic week, and hopefully see you next Monday to learn all about that review of some of the academic research on DNS and security from papers from the last year or so. So look forward to seeing you all again then. Have a great week, though. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Andrew.